so this is AP World History, Chapter 6, Early Societies in Americas and Oceania. So let's go ahead and get started. Today we're going to look at early Mesoamerica, the early societies in Mesoamerica. So for you, you might know Mesoamerica as Latin America. That's really what you need to think of. Like when we talk anytime about Mesoamerica, we're talking about Latin America. So let's kind of just look at this map here. These are the possible migrations of the first Americans, of the Native Americans, which are considered the first Americans. So as you can see, based on the map, they're coming from the Eastern Hemisphere. They're coming either through ice bridges and into North America, down into South America, or they're coming through long distance travel, through maritime travel. So one of these two are the possible migrations as to how they got here and populated the Americas. This next map shows the Mayas. We're going to look at the Mayas. They'll be one of the main focus of societies that we look at today. And then another map here. Again, this is the Mayan, but before that, we'll look at the Olmecs who preceded them, and then we'll look at Teotihuacan that will come after the Mayans. So let's go ahead and get started with the Olmecs. And we start with their agriculture first. So by 8,000 to 7,000 BC, the Olmecs will extend from Mexico to Honduras and El Salvador. And in the beginning, they'll have various types of food that they grow. But in the end, maize will be just another word for corn. That will be their staple crop, meaning that's the main crop that they grow. They didn't really keep very many animals. They couldn't domesticate them. Especially the larger animals, they were not able to domesticate them. But the ones they did keep that they did domesticate were turkeys, barkless dogs, and they usually did this to, I know it sounds bad, but they usually did this to eat them. Okay, this was kind of their protein. They didn't have a lot of other ways to get protein. So, because they couldn't domesticate goats and, cows and that kind of thing. So, these were usually the animals that were up for consumption. Human laborers were the ones who obviously cultivated, and not only that, because there were not large animals that were domesticated, that means that human labor is going to be how they do everything. So you need to, pull 300 pounds. Well, you're going to use a human to do that. You don't have a beast of burden, a donkey or a horse or anything like that to help you. So human labor was essential to these Mesoamerican societies. And again, there's no wheeled vehicles, which kind of makes sense. If you don't have an animal to attach it to, then they probably didn't see the purpose of creating wheeled vehicles, even if they thought maybe it would help themselves. So the Olmecs, one of the things that they did have were ceremonial centers. And this is a common feature that you're going to see in all of the societies that we talk about. And the ceremonial centers were not necessarily built in cities, but instead they were these monumental pyramids that had temples around them as well, and palaces. The palaces are located near agricultural villages, so that's different in regard to how we see it in the other river valley civilizations. Pretty much the temple or the ziggurat or anything like that was within the city. This is different. It's like you have the ceremonial center, and then you have people who are still living in their agricultural villages. They're not living in the city. So this is a big difference from the Eastern civilizations. So the Olmecs are known as the rubber people, and that's not what the name means. It's just that that was what was around them. The rubber trees were what was around them, and so when they discovered this, ancient society, they saw that the rubber was something that they used in their society, and based off of that, they created the Olmecs. The ceremonial center was near the Gulf of Mexico, and it became Olmec society. So, like I said, these ceremonial centers, these are like the centers where you would come and you would do your prayer, have your rituals, go to market there. But then at the end, you go back to your farms. You're not, again, living in the city. As I mentioned, Olmec means rubber people, and it derives from the rubber tree. So this is an example of how they get the rubber or the sap from the tree. I'm sorry, it's not sap. It's not sap. It's just some sort of liquid that comes from the tree, and then it combines, it hardens into rubber. And depending on, how dense you want to make it will determine how much rubber you put into it. So it derives from the rubber trees. The Olmecs, they had cultural traditions that will influence pretty much all of their descendants, the Mayas, the Teotihuacans. So their ceremonial centers were San Lorenzo, La Venta, and Tres Zapotes. And they will have three ceremonial centers because they will destroy San Lorenzo, and then they will move to another place and create these other ceremonial centers. So we don't know much about the Olmecs, but what we do know is that they were probably authoritarian in nature, meaning there was a main ruler that was ruling over the whole area. Common subjects labored regularly on the behalf of the Olmec elites. So what this means is that, they had people who were going to create these projects, these community projects to help their society flourish. And then, of course, you also saw distinctive art creations in Olmec society. These colossal heads that you see here, these were created by the Olmecs. They're usually about 10 feet tall and weigh about 20 tons. And then right here just kind of gives you the variances of them, the different ones that they found in the different areas. Like this one was found in one of the ceremonial centers in La Venta, and then over here this one was found in San Lorenzo. And they're thought to be possible likeness of a ruler. So that's a possibility as to why they created these. So your first two questions, why do you think that the civilizations of Mesoamerica had not invented the wheel? And why do you think palaces were located near agricultural villages and not cities? All right, continuing on with the Olmecs, in particular with jade and obsidian. So again, they spread their influence by military force, but trade was also important to them. So if they didn't conquer you by their military, they were going to gain your alliance through the trade that they had with you. A lot of decorative objects were made by jade. Okay, so this Olmec is an Olmec jade mask. And they had to import the jade. So it wasn't necessarily that it was exclusive to the area. Also, very different from the other river valley civilizations was that there was no metal in this area. So they couldn't make bronze, they couldn't make iron, any basic, metal, copper even. So what they did use was obsidian. And they used it to make knives, axes, cutting edges. So this is an example of the obsidian that they would use. So when the Olmecs finally come to an end, there's not a particular, one specific reason why they fall. There's a lot of possible theories. Some say that they fell because they intentionally destroyed their ceremonial centers because they did not like the way that the ruler was leading. Some say there were civil conflicts that were occurring within the society. Um, Others say that they kind of degraded their land as well. So there's not one main theory as to why the Olmecs fell, but there was the decline that obviously occurred. One of the accomplishments that we do see with the Olmecs is that they were able to create a calendar to keep track of the seasons. And they also created a distinctive ball game where they had to use a rubber ball and kick it all the way through a small hole. Um, so might be possibly how we got soccer. So it's generally accepted that these heads, like I said, are portraits of rulers and that they were perhaps dressed as ball players. And so far, 17 heads have been unearthed so far. This is the court, where they would kind of play ball sometimes. So at the very bottom is the ball area here, and then kind of like the seating and stuff. And again, just a map so you can kind of see where everything is located. The ceremonial center of La Venta, then San Lorenzo, and then Tres Zapotes. So again, we don't know why they moved in particular, but it could have been like ecological degradation, civil wars, and then they just moved from place to place. Maybe something similar to like the idea of the mandate of heaven. And then again, here's the Olmecs right here. So after the Olmecs come the Mayas. They're the heirs to the Olmecs. And it's important to note that they keep a lot of what the Olmecs do. So for the Mayas, they're located in southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. And it was excellent conditions for agriculture. They were able to grow many different crops. Again, still the main crop for them is going to be the maize, the corn, but they were also able to grow cotton as well. So they were able to have a lot of different variety in their agriculture. We see permanent villages in the 3rd century, especially in Kaminaliu, which was a ceremonial city, and this will fall under economic and political dominance of the Teotihuacan later on. So they'll take over this area. The other thing that they harvested that was like a commodity to them was the cacao. All right, so this is the cacao, how it looks like. And it was consumed mainly by the nobles. They thought it was a commodity, it was something very special. And sometimes they would eat the seed whole. Sometimes they would put the seed kind of like in a tea kind of drink. So again, similar to the Olmecs, the Mayas also have centers. Tikal was the most important political center for the Mayas during the 4th and 19th centuries. You went there, you were going to see plazas, temples, pyramids, palaces, all these different things there. You're also going to see the temple of the giant jaguar, this one that you see here. And this was the idea that it represented the control over the surrounding region. For them, the jaguar was this very strong and powerful animal that lived among them. So to honor them, they would name their temples after them. And of course, they're organized into a lot of small kingdoms, the Mayas are. So they're not a unified empire the way we see it in the other River Valley civilizations. So we're also going to look at the Mayan warfare. So the Mayan kingdom fought constantly with one another. Before, they used to think that there was like a peaceable society, but then as more evidence came out, they saw that, they were actually pretty violent. And it was not so much when they would fight, it wasn't that they were necessarily fighting to kill, but it was kind of like, not sport, but to show how strong you were as a fighter. Warriors won prestige when they were able to bring back captives from their neighbors. It showed, look at the power I have, look at the strength I have. And most of the times you became a slave or you were given up to sacrifice. Okay, so Chichen Itza is and established a larger political framework for the Mayan society, another political center. And it was different because the other political centers or the other Mayan people and living in these Mayan areas, they would pretty much kill the people they caught. Chichen Itza was different because they actually wanted to absorb the captives and integrate them into their society. So instead of killing you, we want you to be a part of our society. If the captives refuse, then they would pretty much kill them and say, well, all right, you're not going to be one of us, then we're going to go ahead and let you go. And they would offer them up for sacrifice. All right, so in terms of the Mayan decline, it happens about 800 CE. Most Mayan cities people began to desert their cities. Again, no exact explanation why. We just know that invasions by foreigners from Mexico and there was internal dissension and civil war. So it's probably a combination of all of it that will lead to the fall of the Mayas. So here you go. 3. What are similarities and differences between early societies in the Americas and those of Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, and China? So the next thing we're going to look at, still dealing with the Mayas, is society and religion. The Mayas made a lot of achievements that we still use today, such as the Mayan calendar. So it was an elaborate calendar from the Americas. And pretty much they had 2 calendars. One was a solar calendar, and that was used to determine this is when we're going to farm, this is when we're going to harvest, this is when we're going to cultivate. The other was a ritual calendar, and it was 260 days and pretty much governed daily affairs. So what they would do is kind of like look at both of them to try to determine what was needed for each day. And they believed each day derived, like I said, certain characteristics, and that it was important for them to determine the fortune of the activities taken that day so they can make sure everything stays peaceful. So this is an example of both calendars together and how probably they looked at one area and another area to determine the fortune. The other thing that we see that the Mayas were able to accomplish was writing. So there's written inscriptions. They were flexible and sophisticated of all the early systems. Very unique to them is that some of them were ideographic, meaning that maybe two pictures will represent an idea, and some of them were symbols, where a symbol would represent a sound, a syllable. So they would bring these two together, and that's how they created their writing system. We don't have a lot of information on them also because when the Europeans came to the Americas, they destroyed most of their records, their written records. So what we do have left, a lot of it is about astronomy and the calendar. But we do know from some of the stuff that we also found was that they wrote about history, poetry, myth, that kind of thing. And then these are kind of examples, artifacts of the Mayan writing and what they determined some of these possibly could mean, the letters. And then right here was how they did the math in the Mayan times. So, with regard to religion, um, the Mayas had a creation story called the Popol Vuh, and this was pretty much telling them this is how we got here. And it was believed that the gods created the humans out of maize and water, and that was going to equal humanity, which makes sense if you see that their staple crop is maize, and that's what they use to sustain themselves. So it kind of makes sense for them. The Mayan religion reflected the fundamental role of agriculture in their society, and much like those of the Eastern Hemisphere, how they relied on these gods to help them. So the bloodletting rituals, this is a little different than the Eastern Hemisphere, the other river valley civilizations. So for the Mayas, they felt that it was necessary to have these bloodletting rituals, which is pretty much, cutting off ends of fingers or, cutting a hole through your lip and dragging a vine through it to let out the blood. This was pretty much the idea that they felt they had to give ritual sacrifice all the time in order to keep the world going, in order to please the gods. And sometimes it would be different people who would be sacrificed. Sometimes it would be the captives. Other times, Mayans themselves would volunteer. They took it as a form of honor. So it just depended. But the bloodletting they felt was a necessity for everyday life. All right, 4 and 5. What are common themes that all river valley civilizations share in terms of religion? And 5, why do you think we only see strong emphasis on human sacrifice in the civilizations of the Americas, like the Olmecs and the Mayas? So moving on still to the society, we're going to look at the Mayan ball game. So like I told you, two men, pretty much the way it works, two men played against each other. Sometimes you had four men play against each other. And nobody knows why they played this game. A lot of it, people say, is it was obviously just basic sport for competition. Other people say that it ended political or created political alliances. Still, it um, gave people a way to bet, and also too that the captives could kind of fight for their freedom in this way. But this is what it looked like here. Here's the court, and then this is the ring they had to get it through. And the ball was really heavy, so it was difficult. So after the Mayas, we see the Teotihuacan, the city of Teotihuacan, come about, and probably a large agricultural village as well. It had these large pyramids, Pyramid of the Sun and Pyramid of the Moon, to show honor to kind of the idea of the cycle of night and day and the importance of life. So it was a thriving metropolis with temples, palatial residence. This one was more similar in that idea to what we see in the other river valley civilizations with cities where you had the apartments, you had the neighborhoods in that area, okay, and not so much like the Olmecs where it was like we're just going to go into the temples, into the plaza, and then we're going to leave. And they think it's somewhat of a theocracy. So in this city, in this society, you're going to see a lot of cultivators, artisans, and merchants. You see it through the artifacts that they left here. What it was thought was that 2/3 of they worked in the fields during the day, so they would come into the city, go out and farm, and then come back in. And then the other artisans, they would use obsidian to create different kinds of decorative objects, or obsidian to also create the weaponry. And of course, pottery was still in existence. What we do know is that they also had large networks of trade that they had, and they had very little military organization. For them, they were more successful because people wanted to trade with them, because other surrounding areas wanted to trade with them. So they didn't really feel the need to have a strong military, and they didn't have any walls, which will also kind of lead to their decline. Cultural traditions, again, similar to those that we've seen before in the Mayas and the Olmecs. The Olmecs really set the stage for the traditions of these Mesoamerican societies. So, as I mentioned, the decline of Teotihuacan, military pressure from other people around them, from their surrounding neighbors. Again, that makes sense since we know that they didn't have a strong military. It would be easy for the others to come and invade, and that's pretty much what happened in the 8th century. We see invaders sack and burn the city, and they also destroy a lot of books and monuments. All right, so question 6, why do you think Teotihuacan did not have a strong military organization? Your takeaways here would be that, the Olmecs, Mayas, and Teotihuacan, they all shared similar cultural traditions. That would be one takeaway. The other is that in many ways, they were different than the Eastern Hemisphere, than the other river valley civilizations we looked at, but yet still similar, especially in the religious aspect of it, too. And then just keep in mind also that they lacked, they lacked any beasts of burden. So a lot of it was just manual labor that they did. They were able to improvise with what they had to create a successful society. So it brings up the question, is there a necessity to have all this creation and still be successful? Can you just live on a basic means? All right, so the next time we will look at the early societies in South America.